There was a time when kingdoms measured their power by the size of their armies, by how many men they could send to die for a flag. But what if I told you that long before cannons roared or swords clashed, another kind of war had already begun, one that didn't need soldiers, only signatures. A quiet war, fought in ledgers, not on battlefields. This was the birth of the invisible weapon money. It began in the marble streets of Renaissance Italy. Merchants became lenders, lenders became kings. The Medici family, once mere traders, discovered that lending to princes paid better than selling to peasants. Gold replaced swords as the true tool of conquest. They funded wars, built cathedrals, and bought influence that no army could defend against. They learned that whoever controls credit controls destiny. Centuries later, another family would perfect this art, the Rothschilds. 5 brothers scattered across Europe, connected by code words and couriers faster than any army. When kings declared war, the Rothschilds declared opportunity. They financed both sides, betting not on victory, but on chaos. While empires marched to battle, the brothers moved money through invisible channels, turning war into the world's most profitable business. There's an old parable about 2 rival kings who go to war. Each believes the other to be the enemy, but neither realizes that the same merchant supplied their weapons, their uniforms, even their food. The longer they fight, the richer he becomes. And when both kingdoms lie in ruins, the merchant buys their land for a fraction of what it's worth. That merchant is the banker. The war was never between kings, it was between debt and survival. By the 18th century, money itself had become a weapon sharper than any blade. Nations didn't fall because they lost battles. They fell because they ran out of credit. The cost of every cannonball, every ship, every soldier's wage came from borrowed gold. Britain fought France for control of the seas, but behind both crowns stood the same financiers, lending, collecting, and lending again. Wars were no longer just political or territorial, they were profitable investments. And this changed everything. War no longer needed to be won to serve its purpose. It only needed to continue long enough to generate interest. When a country borrowed to fund a campaign, it mortgaged its future. When it lost, the bankers seized its assets. When it won, they financed the reconstruction. Either way, the lenders won. The illusion of control was complete. The generals believed they were shaping history. The bankers were shaping debt. Gold became gunpowder. Credit became conquest. And the idea that money could serve all men equally, that dream began to die. Because once war became business, peace became bad for business. And in that quiet shift from sword to signature, from battlefield to balance sheet, the fate of empires changed forever. 2 kings sat across a chessboard. One wore the red of Britain, the other the blue of France. Each believed he was in command, pushing pawns across the map of Europe. But neither noticed the quiet man who had built the board, carved the pieces, and lent them both the gold to play. His smile never changed, whether red or blue won the match. In the 18th century, war was no longer a test of courage, but of credit. Britain borrowed to rule the seas. France borrowed to challenge her. Every ship that sailed, every musket fired, was paid for with promises, bonds, not bullets. Gold flowed like blood, and debt became the new lifeblood of empire. When the British crown could no longer afford its wars, it turned to private bankers. Thus, the Bank of England was born not as a symbol of stability, but as a last resort. It was called a public institution, but its money came from private hands. In return for saving the empire, those hands gained the power to print its currency and charge interest on its very survival. Across the channel, France followed suit. The monarchy borrowed until the people broke. When bread prices rose and the guillotine was raised, it wasn't only a revolt against kings, it was a revolt against debt. But the lesson went unnoticed. The world saw revolutions and victories. The bankers saw opportunity. Nations were learning a dangerous habit. Every crisis could be solved by borrowing more. The chess game never ended, it only changed players. Kings would come and go, flags would rise and fall, but the lender would always remain seated, quietly watching from the shadows. And so began the age of the crown's debt, where even power itself had a price tag. Napoleon believed he could rule Europe with armies. He never realized someone else already ruled it with information. While his cannons thundered across the continent, a quiet network of bankers was moving faster than any regiment. They didn't need soldiers. They had couriers, codes, and the most valuable weapon of all knowledge before anyone else had it. Among them was the House of Rothschild. 5 brothers stationed in 5 cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, each a pillar in an invisible empire. They financed kings, funded wars, and, most importantly, controlled the flow of news. In an age when messages took days to travel, their pigeons and couriers could deliver truth or silence in hours. When the Battle of Waterloo erupted, Europe held its breath. Would Napoleon return as emperor or vanish into exile? The Rothschilds knew the answer before the British government did. Nathan Rothschild, stationed in London, received word of Napoleon's defeat a full day before it was made public. And with that single piece of knowledge, he staged one of the greatest financial maneuvers in history. He went to the London Stock Exchange and began to sell quietly, slowly, deliberately. Traders panicked. They assumed Britain had lost. Prices crashed. And just before the truth was announced, Rothschild's agents bought everything back for a fraction of its worth. When the victory became public, the markets soared, and so did his fortune. The story became legend, some say exaggerated, others denied. But whether myth or truth, it revealed something timeless. The real battle was not won on muddy fields, but in the markets that followed them. Napoleon lost an empire of land. Rothschild gained an empire of trust, one that would last long after the cannons went silent. Britain once ruled a quarter of the earth, but its greatest conquest was invisible. It conquered through debt. The empire's red flag may have flown over oceans, but its true power was printed on paper in the city of London. The world didn't just trade with Britain, it borrowed from her. Every loan became a leash. Every interest payment, a quiet surrender. In the 19th century, London wasn't just a city, it was the world's bank. Nations lined up for British credit, and with each signature, their independence shrank. When Britain fought wars, others paid for them. When others fought wars, Britain financed them. The empire had discovered a perfect formula: lend to your rivals, profit from their weakness, and when they fall, own what's left. India became the crown's greatest source of wealth, yet its wealth flowed one way out. Gold, cotton, tea, opium, all traded, all taxed, all tied to the pound. And when China refused to buy Britain's goods, Britain didn't negotiate. It sent warships to force open its ports. The Opium Wars weren't about drugs, they were about debt, demand, and domination. Money became the empire's missionary. By the late 1800s, British bonds financed railways in Argentina, canals in Egypt, and mines in Africa. Each loan came with conditions, military protection, trade privileges, or control of customs. A debtor world was a manageable world. And from the smoke-filled offices of London bankers, the map of empire was redrawn not by explorers, but by accountants. Britain didn't need to own every land it ruled. It only needed the world to owe it money. Because once you control the currency, you don't need to raise a flag the world already marches to your tune. There was once a farmer with 2 neighbors. One lent him seeds, the other lent him tools. Both spoke kindly, both said the same thing: we only want to help you grow. But one day they whispered in his ear that the other had cheated him. Soon, the farmer took up his plow as a weapon. Fields burned, fences fell, and when it was over, his land was ruined. The two lenders arrived again, this time offering loans to rebuild what they had helped destroy. The farmer accepted. He never realized that while he had fought for pride, they had profited from his pain. That parable was not fiction, it was the 20th century. The Great War, the war to end all wars, began with kings and ended with creditors. Nations borrowed to build bombs, then borrowed again to bury the dead. By the end, the world was drowning in debt. Empires collapsed not because their armies failed, but because their treasuries did. Banks had funded both sides. The same firms that armed Britain also lent to Germany. War had become a business plan, destruction first, reconstruction later. When peace came, it came with interest rates. The victors demanded reparations. The defeated paid with inflation. Germany's currency burned so fast that children played with banknotes instead of toys. And from the ashes rose new lenders, America's banks, offering loans to rebuild the world they had helped finance into ruin. The world order was reborn, but the logic remained unchanged. Nations fight, bankers fund, and when it's over, the debt remains eternal. Because in the banker's paradox, war and peace serve the same master. One destroys, the other rebuilds, but both are paid for with borrowed money, and the farmer never stops working. When the British Empire began to fade, the torch of money didn't go out, it was simply passed across the Atlantic. America rose not through conquest, but through credit. The 20th century's great empire wasn't built on colonies, but on contracts. Its soldiers carried guns, but its bankers carried something stronger, the dollar. It began in 1913 with the birth of the Federal Reserve, a private institution disguised as a public guardian. It promised stability, but quietly ensured that money would forever be borrowed into existence. When the First World War broke out, Europe borrowed from America. When the Second came, they borrowed again. By the time the guns fell silent, the old world owed the new one everything. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. The deal was simple. The US would hold the gold, and everyone else would hold the dollar. But the gold standard was just a costume behind it. America printed paper backed by faith, not metal. And faith, once lost, can never be easily replaced. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe's ruins, but it also tied their economies to American banks. The IMF and World Bank were born institutions that preached development while writing rules that guaranteed dependence. Later came the petrodollar, oil priced only in dollars, ensuring that energy itself bowed to American currency. Every barrel of oil burned was a quiet tribute paid to Washington's power. Yet beneath this empire of peace and prosperity lay the same pattern as before: loans, leverage, and invisible control. The faces changed, the accents changed, but the system did not. Britain had ruled the world with ships, America ruled it with debt. The throne may have changed hands, but the crown still belonged to the banker. The world still wages war, only now it wears a suit and speaks in numbers. Armies are smaller, but debts are bigger. Missiles are replaced by markets, and sanctions strike harder than bombs. Nations no longer invade each other's lands, they invade each other's balance sheets. This is the hidden war of today, silent, global, and fought in spreadsheets. When one country's currency weakens, another's exports collapse. When interest rates rise, economies tumble. The battlefield is digital, but the casualties are real. Lost jobs, broken systems, hungry people. Power no longer comes from territory, it comes from who prints the money that others must use. China lends to the developing world with silk words and long contracts, offering roads and ports in exchange for repayment that may never come. America runs trillion-dollar deficits, knowing that the world still needs its dollar to trade oil and settle debts. Europe, once united by a dream, now wrestles with the price of its shared currency. And in this quiet chaos, Every nation fights to avoid becoming the next debtor empire, but the pattern is ancient. Rome drained its provinces to sustain its luxuries. Britain lent its way into dominance. Now, the same melody plays again, only faster, louder, and digital. The tools have changed, the rules have not. The banker's pen is still the sharpest weapon on earth. A single decision in a boardroom can collapse a currency, spark inflation, or reshape a continent. Empires rise and fall not by who fires first, but by who funds last. In this new kind of war, the victors don't march in parades, they quietly collect interest. And the nations that once fought for freedom now fight for liquidity, still bound by the oldest chain of all debt. In the end, every empire keeps two ledgers, one written in numbers, the other in truth. The first counts profit, growth, and debt. The second records something deeper, the cost of forgetting what money really means. When the two no longer match, collapse begins. Rome once ruled the known world, but it fell not from invasion, from inflation. To pay its armies, it mixed bronze into its silver coins, pretending value could be stretched like metal. The people believed the lie until bread cost more than gold. The empire that conquered through discipline died through delusion. Centuries later, Britain did the same in paper form. To fund wars and colonies, it printed promises faster than it could keep them. Inflation became the quiet thief that robbed its empire from within. When the pound finally yielded to the dollar, it wasn't the loss of military might that ended British dominance. It was the loss of faith in its money. And now, America stands at the same threshold. Its empire is not carved in land, but in numbers, zeros on screens, debt upon debt, endlessly borrowed to postpone the reckoning. The dollar still rules, but its throne trembles. Printing more has replaced producing more, and the world watches as confidence, the true currency, begins to fade. If war made bankers rich, then peace, it seems, made them restless. For what happens when the machine that profits from crisis runs out of enemies to fight? It turns inward. In the final ledger, truth always balances the books. The coin melts into paper, the paper fades into nothing, and only the lesson remains. No empire can counterfeit trust forever. Because in the end, the debt that destroys a civilization isn't financial, it's moral.